Hi, I'm Tom Eschen, the host of this Power in Politics podcast, a conversation about the issues that are impacting New Yorkers the most, talking to the people that are making those decisions, holding them accountable along the way, too. Today, in the fallout of the 2024 election, we speak with David Sirota, the former Bernie Sanders speechwriter, who also founded his own news network, The Lever News is what it's called, and also was a co-writer and also an Academy Award nominee for Don't Look Up, the 2021 film, apocalyptic type film at that, with a lot of big stars in that movie as well. We actually ask him about that to apply some of the themes there to what's going on politically today. We also ask him what the Democratic Party should be doing right now in the fallout in the wake of the election, in which the Republicans, as you know, did quite well, especially at the top of the ticket there. Thanks so much for listening and joining as always, and make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcast, Power and Politics. Also, you can see our YouTube videos at CBS 6 Albany. Thank you very much. Yes, David does join us now. David, thanks so much for taking the time with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, so let's start simply, I guess. It might not be so simple of a question. What should be happening in the Democratic Party right now today?
The party should be asking, why did we lose the demographics, the voting demographics that we lost after having more support among those demographics? And I think when you look at who the Democratic Party lost, it tells an important story. The exit polls tell us that Democrats lost ground among Latino voters, working class voters, male voters. Those were the big losses. And I should mention young voters. And then the question becomes, well, why did the Democrats lose those voters? Well, one partial answer might be found in Bernie Sanders. Those happen to be the demographics that Bernie Sanders polled the strongest among. And after 2016 and after 2020, the party really kind of vilified Bernie Sanders and his movement, kind of ostracized his movement. At one point, there was a lot of talk about, negative talk about Bernie bros. And I think that sent a message to a lot of those voters that, hey, you may have been supportive of that movement, not just that candidate, but that movement and the working class politics of that movement. But we, the Democratic Party, are not that interested in that kind of politics. And I think that message was heard loud and clear. And I think some voters started looking for a different set of answers. And Donald Trump and the Trump campaign told a different kind of populist working class story. It's not a story that I agree with, but I think it appealed to people who were disaffected and disillusioned with politics as usual, people that the Democratic Party kind of shunned. And I think the party needs to be asking, why did we actually shun those people when they were at some point predisposed to support us? Have we told a different story?
It's interesting. After Bernie came out and spoke a few days after the election about some of those things you talked about, you saw with the DNC chair, Jamie Harrison, said this is ludicrous. Joe Biden's been the most pro-worker president of all time, and citing the job growth month after month. What's missing from that message there? Why do you think things look differently?
I think there's a difference between being for populist, progressive, pro-working class policies and telling a story that contextualizes those policies. Donald Trump tells a story about good and bad, about villains. He says the villains are immigrants, academics, liberals, Democrats, and the like. I don't agree with who he's saying are the villains. I think it's wrong-headed. I think it's ugly. Democrats don't really tell much of a villain story at all. They say here are the policy prescriptions for these problems, but they don't really tell a story about who created those problems. And they're not really specific about it. They don't like to talk that much about, for instance, the problem in the healthcare system are the health insurance companies that rip us all off. They don't like to really tell a story about the drug companies ripping us off. They say drug prices are high, but there's not a story about who the villains are. And the question is, well, why don't they tell that villain story? And I think the answer is because they're afraid of their own donor base, that they're afraid to tell a villain story about their own donors who are creating the problems that they're diagnosing. They're trying to essentially have it both ways, which ends up being sounding like a kind of inauthentic, fraidy cat kind of story. And I think it doesn't really connect. So I guess the short way of answering that is, if you're going to push those policies, which I think Joe Biden has pushed a lot of pro-worker, pro-labor, pro-working class policies. But if you're going to do that, you have to tell the story. And one other thing that's worth adding, Joe Biden was in a kind of decline. I mean, he wasn't exactly the most energetic salesperson for these policies. So one other takeaway is there's going to be an inherent challenge of pushing forward policies if the guy at the top of the sales pitch is not really the best salesman.
It's interesting you mentioned, I was going to get to this a little bit later, but you talked about the story aspect. And I did a sit down with Pete Buttigieg a few weeks ago now about his messaging. And I asked him, why doesn't half of the country believe you? He does a lot of his, he goes on Fox News and he talks about these facts and statistics. And he said, well, we have to tell more stories. I guess, how do you make that proliferate amongst the party at the end of the day? Because obviously he was a messenger, but I told him, I said, well, are you the only one doing this? Who else can you get out there to be able to tell this story at the end of the day?
I think the key is not just to tell story. Bill Clinton was great at telling stories, great at stories diagnosing the problem, a story of somebody struggling, a mom and pop shop and the like. I think what I'm specifically saying, and I think Pete Buttigieg, for instance, in the job that he is in and at the Department of Transportation, he can tell these stories, which is a story of good actors and bad actors. A story, I use the shorthand, villains. In his case, he has cracked down. I mean, it took a while to pressure him to do it, but he has cracked down on the airlines. The airlines were bad actors, and he has positioned himself as somebody trying to regulate them, to fight them, to stop their worst behavior. There is a villain story to tell there. And I think the point of focusing on who the villain is not just to demonize anybody just for the sake of demonizing people, but it's because the average voter knows there are villains, right? The average voter has been mistreated by an airline. The average voter has been mistreated by a health insurance company. The average voter has been mistreated by big corporations in the economy. And so when you're not willing to say that as a party, you're coming off as afraid to say it. You're coming off as trying to have it both ways. And so what I think Donald Trump fundamentally understands that, which is why he connects with the working class. And there's sort of a contradiction. Why is a billionaire, backed by billionaires, the working class candidate? I think there's an authenticity factor there. You can say a lot about Donald Trump. Donald Trump lies all the time about the facts, et cetera, et cetera. But I do think he comes off as authentically Donald Trump. There is an authenticity to it that he derives from being willing to name. Again, I don't think they're the real villains, but he tells a story about villains. And Democrats need to become a lot more comfortable doing that.
It's interesting. You described that in a way, in a sentence. You said, you look at the lies, but at the same time, the authenticity, what sometimes would fall in confluence to each other. A bit of an oxymoron, but I don't think you're wrong. And I think that's actually a really good assessment from what I've heard, especially from Trump voters and those from both sides of the aisle. So following up here on these stories, and now from a progressive look at how to tell that, and you would look at conservative side of the aisle would say, well, that's a one size fits all. And I don't think that can apply in terms of the government trying to say this works for everyone. How do you apply a progressive policy to that kind of feeling of you're reaching all of those voters at the same time that might not exactly prescribe to those policies right now?
Well, I think two things. I think one, part of what government is supposed to be doing is to be regulating and preventing the worst behavior by corporate actors across the economy. And those are things that can benefit. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, middle class, it doesn't matter. That the government is supposed to be a kind of universal fighter against the worst excesses of corporate behavior. I think you can tell lots of stories about that. When drug companies are ripping us off with the highest prices in the world, prices higher than they charge in Canada and the like, there's a story to tell about how the government can stop that. When health insurance companies continue to jack up their premiums at record levels, ripping more and more of us off, the government has ways without spending any money to prevent that kind of price gouging. So there are ways to tell the story of the government's role as a regulator of the worst excesses. Again, the government as a kind of universal force. It helps everybody. And I would similarly say that when Democrats talk about social programs, money and spending as a social safety net, I think we've learned, and I think it's been a bad trend, that they're so focused on precision and means testing and making everything so complicated in the name of that precision that it feels like to access much of what they're proposing would require wading through impossible and frustrating and annoying red tape. I guess that's a long way of saying that what the Democrats need to get back to are the principles baked into the party's most popular policies, the most popular policies in American history: Medicare, Social Security. These are universal, easy to access priorities and programs that everybody accesses, rich or poor. They're not burying you in red tape. And I think the Democrats have sort of become unmoored from that and need to get back to exactly that.
Is this just a federal messaging issue? Because you look in Colorado, for example, where you are, that was one of the least red places in the country. And here in New York, we had 3 congressional seats go from red to blue. They were all flipped back this time around. So there were some messages that were being heard. I guess I'm wondering, where is it falling on deaf ears where you can see some of those different blue lights, I guess, right now in this country?
Well, certainly, I think that anybody running for federal office is inherently seen as an extension of the national both parties' brands. And so when you're voting for Senate or Congress, it's a different kind of vote than if you're voting for governor or state legislature. And I think voters actually make that distinction. And so I think clearly the National Democratic Party brand has a real problem. The party ran on democracy. The party ran on restoring norms. The party ran against Donald Trump's erratic behavior. Donald Trump, in one sense, ran the kind of campaign that the Democrats used to run, which is the old idea that was, coined by the Bill Clinton campaign in 1992. It's the economy, stupid, right? I mean, that Donald Trump fundamentally ran an "it's the economy, stupid" campaign, and Democrats ran a pro-democracy campaign, and people are going to vote on the economy and whether they can survive in the economy before they vote on high-minded concepts like democracy. And you don't have to believe me on that. Literally, that's what FDR said way back in the middle of the Great Depression. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically said, democracy has disappeared in other nations because it's not because people didn't like democracy, it's because they prioritized voting to get something to eat. They had seen government of dysfunction. They were essentially starving or feeling economically dislocated, and they prioritized voting for candidates who promised to fix that, regardless of the implications for democracy.
And I think that the democracy conversation plays its way in the trust. And I think so that's something you've talked about that gets us to Don't Look Up back in 2021. That one of the underlying themes there is trust of the government, of the media, of science at the end. And that obviously there was a lot of parallels at that point to the pandemic. Here we are in 2024, and you look at the trust and I was watching CNN this morning. They talked about some of these appointments that are being made right now in the cabinet and the fact that this is what people voted for because they didn't trust the current system of government. I guess through that lens, the movie that you co-wrote, 2021, Don't Look Up, how do some of those themes apply to today?
I think you're touching on something that's so important, that the lack of trust in government is both understandable and a huge problem. By the way, not just a problem for the Democratic Party, problem for our society. I think that people continue to vote for change. I think if you look at 4 of the last 5 elections, they have been change elections: 2008, 2016, 2020, 2024. People keep voting for change. And by the way, I think 2012 skipped because the Republicans put up Mitt Romney, who actually looked more status quo like than even the current administration. So people keep voting for change because they don't trust the government. And I think then the question becomes, why don't people trust the government and the political class? And it's a long story, but I would say this. I would say, especially if you look at the last 14, 16 years, you see in 2008, Obama ran for president with big promises during the financial crisis, big promises of hope and change. And I think ultimately, hope and change became a rescue of the current status quo financial system while millions of people were thrown out of their homes. And I think that destroyed what remained of some basic trust in the political system. And in some ways, I think we are living through the reverberations of that. So Don't Look Up is sort of an extreme version of what happens when when the population feels it can trust nothing, not even science. And I think that movie is designed to be not prophecy, not destiny, but a cautionary tale. We don't want to go there. Now, I will say, I'm very concerned that people feel like they voted for change. And people can vote for change for Donald Trump, who happened to be the change agent this time because he was not the incumbent. But that what comes next is going to be even more extreme policies that doesn't necessarily deliver on the mandate of change, the kind of change that people thought they were voting for, which will only further degrade that feeling of trust.
And you think about the work that the Republican Party has been doing, and you touch upon that in your podcast, The Master Plan, a little bit here over the conservative mindset, I could say, as well there over the course of the past few decades, right? And in terms of building up their talking points and what they believe that would resonate with voters. And that podcast, you touch a lot about the Supreme Court and kind of what went into that. How does that play, I'm curious, into winning elections at the end of the day? Because the Supreme Court, they're not elected officials, but there's something to that. How does that play into policy and what people want at the end of the day?
Well, one of the big problems with trust right now is money in politics. I think we just experienced an election in which billionaires didn't just fund the election; they were central characters in the election. I mean, Elon Musk was literally on the stage, but Kamala Harris had Mark Cuban as one of her TV surrogates. This was almost a celebration of billionaires and of money in politics. And money's corrosive nature in politics is that those with the money have the ability to communicate with voters, and those who don't have the money can't really communicate with voters. And so we have a system that answers to money. That money comes with the expectation of legislative favors. And I think the point is that people sense that while we're calling this democracy, it's not really a functioning one person, one vote democracy when billionaires get to call the shots through a deregulated campaign finance system that preferences and prioritizes and amplifies their voices above everybody else. So I think what Master Plan traces is what was the master plan to effectively legalize corruption, to deregulate campaign finance to the point where billionaires are now just openly and freely funding particular candidates, where Donald Trump, for instance, went out and said, to the oil industry, give me $1 billion of campaign money, I'll give you the policies you want, where the Democrats' donors are demanding that the Democratic candidate, if she wins, fires the regulator regulating their business, right? We have turned elections into auctions, and that was not an accident. There were a specific set of people who made specific decisions to try to do this through the Supreme Court, ultimately to get people on the Supreme Court to issue rulings like Citizens United that deregulated everything. And I just go back to, it doesn't have to be this way. John McCain ran a campaign to crack down on the worst excesses of the campaign finance system because he understood that it was eroding democracy. It was eroding people's trust in the system. We haven't had that yet, that kind of backlash, but I feel like after the election we just experienced, the time is ripe. We all just saw what we saw. I don't care if you like the election outcome or you don't. The celebration of billionaires and big money in the election is a problem for all of us.
Do you see any parallels to that with how the cabinet appointments are going right now with Donald Trump and some of the individuals that he's deciding to put there that, as we know, have been Trump loyalists for a long time?
Yeah, I mean, it remains to be seen how he fills out his whole cabinet. Right now, it looks like he's filling out his cabinet with loyalists. I'm going to be looking as much as at the personnel choices as what policies are you putting forward? Are they actually helping the working class coalition that supported your candidacy, or are they going mostly to help the billionaires who funded your campaign? Remember, I think roughly a third of Donald Trump's campaign money came from very, very large donors. The question is, are the policies that he and that cabinet put forward going to further enrich those folks, or are those policies going to actually help the working class base of voters that propelled him to the White House? I fear it's going to be the former. I fear that, if his first term is any indication, that it will be a series of policies mostly to benefit the donor class, which again, will erode people's trust in the system. And the question is, at a certain point, people are going to fully give up on the whole system. And what does that look like? It's not a very pretty picture.
What point is that? Because I wonder, and you think about change and voting for change, this certainly is a change. Is it the change people bargained for, I guess is the question, right?
That's the big question. And look, I think that politics has been this pendulum swing. It goes in one direction, it swings back. I think I go back to Obama. I think the Bush administration, both the Iraq War and its economic policies, high income tax cuts, Wall Street deregulation, which led to a financial crisis, et cetera, created the conditions for a Democrat to run a populist campaign in 2008 and win. The problem is that if you win with that mandate and then you don't deliver, guess what? The pendulum's going to swing back. So I certainly think the idea that the Democratic Party is over, it's done, it doesn't exist anymore, I think that's a lot of nonsense. It was a close election. I do think if the Democrats want to be positioned to win again, they have to look at how they lost. They have to ask tough questions of themselves of why they lost the demographics that they lost. They have to ask the question, was it a good or bad idea to see this working class movement within the party's midst, the Bernie Sanders movement, and shun it and insult it and throw it away? Should it have made a different decision to embrace it, to make it more part of the party's culture? And I still think there's time to do that.
I want to circle back to the conversation we were having about trust. We touched a lot on the government trust side of things. And for you, I'm going to go now to the media side of that and news in that world, because you started the Lever News on your own. You've been on kind of both sides of the equation. As you know, I'm in the news myself. I consume a lot of it. And I know that trust has eroded over the years. I think everybody feels that way. How does that get won back at this point?
It's a great question. Look, I think that what we've seen, and you see this in polls, you see this in the exit polls, that lots of the Democratic Party's voter base, the ones who are already with the party, are tuned into traditional media. That the Republicans and independents have fully distrust traditional media. Now, I don't think it's fair to fully distrust traditional media in the sense that journalism is a real profession. It's a real skill. Somebody just blogging or tweeting that's not journalism, right? I mean, there are things you do in journalism that are part of real reporting, fact checking, multiple sourcing, et cetera, et cetera. I think where the trust has been eroded is that people sense that the story selection and the story framing is not the full story. I think that Donald Trump and the right have exploited a lack of trust to tell a story about a media that should never be trusted. And to be clear, look at the Iraq War. Look at the lies that were pumped through the media without question about the Iraq War. Look at the lies that were pumped through the traditional media that justified the financial deregulation that led to the financial crisis and the collapse. I think that traditional media is too often tilted towards the oligarchy, towards the business class, towards storylines and story selection for the affluent class, writing out of the story in a lot of ways, the stories of the working class, the stories of the corporate villains, because traditional media, and I'm speaking broadly here, but is tied to the sort of status quo, whether it's corporate media or billionaire-owned media. And I think people's distrust of that is logical and legitimate. I don't think that means that no media at all should be trusted. I don't think that means that no good journalism happens. I think it means that we need a more diversified media. So the project I'm working on, at the Lever, as one small example of it, it's independent, reader-supported media. And what we're trying to do is have a different orientation. We're not corporate media. We're not big media. And I think what people should be looking for is not media that only serves their ideological predispositions, but media that is first and foremost accurate. Here's the thing. I can be honest with you about what my views on the world are, and I can also be accurate and fair. I can also show you how I'm reporting my stories. If you go to the Lever, you'll see our stories have links to source material. You don't have to believe me. You can go believe the document. And I'm going to show you the document right here. I think the point is not that, we need more of a conservative media or more of a progressive media. It's that we need a media that's more honest about where it's coming from and more transparent about the facts that it's presenting. It's not, I don't believe there's a thing called objectivity. The moment you say this is a story and this is not a story, you have made a subjective decision, and that's okay. What I think the audience wants is for us all to be honest about that and accurate about what the facts are that we're reporting.
David Sirota, really appreciate your perspective. Thank you for your time. You can check it out. It's called the Master Plan Podcast, The Lever. You can also find them, of course, on social media, Twitter, everywhere you can get those places, right?
Absolutely. All those places.
David, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. Hit the subscribe button right now so you can stay up to date on these news-making conversations about the issues impacting New Yorkers the most: power and politics.